Hey friends, it's Luke back with another episode of English in the News. Today, we're going to be learning 4 new, interesting, useful words and phrases in context from the news. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. And now, let's get into it. The first story we're going to talk about today is about the Tennessee House expelling 2 members of the House because of their inappropriate behavior and conduct. Now, if you don't know what the House is, this is the lawmaking body of Tennessee. It's part of the government, let's say, that makes the laws. And 2 members of the House were expelled, essentially meaning they got kicked out. It's a sort of more formal way of saying they got kicked out. So the first word we're going to talk about from this story is setting a precedent. Now, before we really talk about what this means, let's read it in the context of this article. GOP leaders said Thursday's actions were necessary to avoid setting a precedent that lawmakers' disruptions of House proceedings through protest would be tolerated. Now, that means they don't want to tolerate disruptions of House proceedings. But what does it mean to set a precedent? Usually we use the word set with precedent. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, wait a second, that pronunciation sounds very much like president. It's a little different. The difference is s, and that's it. President, precedent. So what does it mean to set a precedent? This essentially means that something is done which then makes that more likely to happen in the future because there was the one that happened before, right? So it's not a formal rule. It's not something usually that's written down. I suppose it could be in some cases, but it's sort of like, oh, this happened before, so that means it can happen again. And if it happened twice, well, then it can happen 3 times, right? And so often we use precedent in a good or bad way to say, hey, there is a precedent for this. Or I think we are setting a precedent here. That could be a good thing, right? In this case, in the view of the GOP or the Republican Party, that would be a bad precedent. They don't want to set the precedent that any protests can just disrupt things whenever they want things to be disrupted. They want to avoid that. And this is a huge debate right now. So just know, set a precedent can be used for both good and bad things. Now, the next one we're going to look at, which is also, I think, very interesting, is flocked. Now, if you already have some idea about what this means, great. You often see this as flocked or flocking, right? But I think we should look at it in context before we really talk about what it means and how it is used. Okay, so thousands of people flocked to the Capitol to support Jones, Pearson, and Johnson on Thursday, cheering and chanting outside the House chamber loudly enough to drown out the proceedings. Okay, so we're still talking about this same story. Thousands of people flocked to the Capitol. I think from that context alone, you can kind of guess what's going on. Jones, Pearson, and Johnson, these are 2 of the 3 people who were expelled from the House. So if thousands of people are flocking, that sort of makes it sound like they're a bunch of birds flying in from all different places to show their support, right? Because again, this is a big debate going on about, hey, these people shouldn't have been kicked out just because they were protesting. They're just trying to represent the people they represent. They believed it was right to protest, and the GOP lawmakers were not fair to try to enforce the rules and kick them out. Okay, I'm not going to comment on the debate, but if you kind of picture the birds flying in, that's the right idea. In fact, a bunch of birds flying from one place to another is called a flock. And flock is used in a lot of different ways, but here it is a verb. And you often see it in news stories. People flocked to this place. People flocked to that place. In fact, one of the other stories I was going to choose about something that happened last week also used flock. So it's very, very common. And it's always about people in large numbers, usually going here, going there, arriving somewhere, or doing something as a large group. Okay, now let's go on to our next story. Our next story is about the Pope. The Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, he got bronchitis. That's a big story, right? He's very old. He's in his mid-80s. And this is the first time in a long time that a pope has had to skip the Good Friday Colosseum thing that they do. There's a big procession at the Colosseum in Rome, and the Pope usually presides over this big procession. It's a very important thing for the Catholic Church, and he's not attending. So we're going to look at a few interesting words and phrases from this one as well, starting with turned out. And the interesting thing is that it could be used in a similar way to flocked. And we'll talk about how that is. I'll try to make the connection for you if you don't see it right away. You may have seen turned out used in other ways. Well, that's because turned out can be used as a phrasal verb in a few different ways. But let's first look at it in context. At this year's procession, in which a tall, slim, lightweight cross was carried by faithful, some 20,000 people turned out, holding lighted candles in the darkness outside the arena. Now, there's something weird about this, and I don't know if it's a typo, but by faithful, I just haven't heard that used before without the in front of it. I would have thought it would be by the faithful, as in the people who have faith. But anyway, I'm not sure. The point is we're looking at turned out here. And now I think you might see the connection to flocked. Some 20,000 people turn out. Okay, so there's a bunch of people and they do something. Well, what does that mean? They appear, they're there, they showed up. But this doesn't suggest that they came from all over. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But anyway, here they are. So what's the difference between turned out and flocked in this case? Again, flock gives us a sense of movement, like there's a large group going from over there to over there. And turned out is more like appeared for that purpose, appeared for that event. And it doesn't say much about them coming from all different places or anywhere in particular. Maybe they just popped right out of the ground. Who knows, right? So that's really the difference, but they are used in a kind of similar way. Now, the last word that we're going to be taking a look at is the word account. Now you might be thinking, you mean like a bank account? Well, account is used in a few different ways, actually. If you can account for something, you can explain it. You can give a description of what happened, or you can say why it happened or why it's there. Can you account for this? Yeah, that's there because... Let's look at it in context first and then try to understand it a little bit better. The selection came from among the many accounts of suffering that Francis has heard from migrants and others who spoke with him during his overseas trips and other occasions. So here, I think we can look at the context, the accounts of suffering. Well, that sounds like the stories of suffering, the retelling of some horrible thing that happened? Does it have to be about suffering? No, right? If you give an account of something, it could be that you're just describing what happened, that you're sort of telling the story. So what's the difference between account and storytelling? When I hear the word account, I don't tend to think of all of the extra stuff that you would add when you tell a story. You try to make it really interesting, you try to make it exciting, you add a bunch of detail, you talk about your personal relationships and your feelings. It's much more flowery, let's say, and focused on being interesting. Whereas when I hear account, I think, okay, this is just what happened. So it might be a more dry version of a story, or maybe something more similar to a report. Give me a report of what happened. Now, it can be used to just tell a story. They can be used in the same way. That's sort of the connotation that I have in my mind when I hear the word account versus story. And it is less common, and I would say definitely more formal sounding. Okay, so that's it for our words, our phrases, and our news stories for this week. If you would like to try to use these in sentences, feel free to share those in the comments. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you haven't already done so, it really helps out the channel if you hit the like button and subscribe. So make sure you do that. And also, you can get a free course, Natural English Conversations, that is in the links in the description. Thanks a lot, and I will see you in the next one.